get so caught up in the day-to-day, instead of keeping your head down and how we can survive. We live by each other like ghosts every day. We go into the struggle, the fight with one another, complacent with the fact that our systems are broken, with the fact that the top 10 will always be first in line, the fact that we are killing our planet and allowing them to keep us divided. We must stand together and rise up. It's time we wake up, and that is a difficult to clear through.
Hey everyone, Carlos here from ADifficultTruth. Thank you so much for joining in this Sunday's podcast. We are broadcasting live from beautiful South Florida, where the only answer to the question of how the weather is hot. That is all we got here. Today's topic, hey, how's it going, man? How's it going, Supreme Heretic? Thank you so much for joining. Today's topic, we're going to be addressing... We're going into a deep dive into fascism. I think that it's something that is extremely important that we break down and not just use the word fascism to basically. It's kind of like the same how conservatives use socialism or communism to things that they don't like. We have to get into this and really understand what it means and how it's defined. Pikachu is not happy behind Mario. Mario is a secret fascist. True story. This is a true and factual story. But yeah, we don't want to just throw around the word fascism. We want to really understand it. And also, history, the history of fascism is extremely important to understand, especially nowadays, and not just use it willy-nilly. According to basically every single basic definition of fascism, fascism is a form of radical right-wing authoritarian ultranationalism political ideology. It's characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and strong regimentation of society and economy. This came to prominence basically by Benito Mussolini. He's the guy that basically invented fascism. And to understand it, because fascism, the thing is, he himself is the guy that made it up, but there's just so many disagreements of what exactly it is. It's not a set kind of political ideology, but it does have some reoccurring characteristics. So we're gonna do a deep dive into this. The first meeting of the Fasci of Revolutionary Action was held in January 24th of 1915. Was led by Benito Mussolini. In the next few years, the relatively small group was various political actions. In 1920, militant strike activity by industrial workers reached its peak in Italy. Mussolini and the fascists took advantage of the situation by allying with industrial businesses and attacking workers and peasants in the name of preserving order and internal peace in Italy. Italian fascism, or simply known as fascism, is the original fascist ideology as developed in Italy. The ideology is associated with the Fascist Revolutionary Party, founded in 1915, the succeeding National Fascist Party in 1921, under which Benito Mussolini ruled the Kingdom of Italy from 1922 and 1943. This happened basically right after the First World War. The Republican Fascist Party that ruled the Italian Social Republic from 1943 to 1945, and the post-war Italian social movement and subsequent Italian neo-fascist movement. Supreme Heretic says, herein lies the issue. So many terms have been watered down these days, and people throw out terms in the completely wrong context. It's a lazy reaction to something you disagree with, and you can't form a cogent argument. So fascist is thrown around quite cavalier today. Yes, and the same can be said by socialism and communism. I mean, you have Lindsey Graham go on Fox TV and say that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is communist. This is ridiculous. It's the same concept. But the whole point is, because history and how this movement came to be is extremely important to understand, and we have to break it down as well as learn from this, basically. Italian fascism was rooted in Italian nationalism and the desire to restore and expand Italian territories deemed necessary for a nation to assert its superiority and strength and avoid succumbing to decay. Italian fascists claimed that modern Italy is the heir to ancient Rome and its legacy. In fact, the term fascism came from the Roman fascis. I can't pronounce it right, but it's basically the bundle of sticks with the axe on the head. That's where the word came from. Okay, so where were we? Italian fascists claimed that modern Italy is the heir to ancient Rome and its legacy, and historically supported the creation of an Italian empire to provide spazio vitale, or living space, for colonizations by Italian settlers and establish control over the Mediterranean Sea. Italian fascism promoted a corporatist economic system whereby employer and employee syndicates were linked together in association to collectively represent the nation's economic producer and worker, alongside to the state national economic policy. This economic system intended to resolve class conflict through collaboration between the classes. Now, here's the thing: the fascists used or took advantage of the wealthy and the elites and the industrialists to come into power. They basically scared them or lied to them that there was a political revolution coming, and that the fascists were the only ones that can basically save them from it. So basically, fascists identified their primary opponents as the majority of socialists on the left who had opposed intervention in World War I. The fascists and Italian political right held common ground, which this is actually important. Both held Marxism in contempt, discounted class consciousness, and believed in the rule of elites. Fascism began to accommodate Italian conservatives by making major alterations to its political agenda, abandoning its previous populism, republicanism, anti-clericalism, adopting policies in support of free enterprise, and accepting the Roman Catholic Church and the monarchy institutions as institutions in Italy. You start seeing a lot of parallels when you understand the history of fascism and how things are going today. Because fascism, or the fascists back then in World War II, as they started, they didn't really have any kind of majority. There was only a few thousands of them, but as soon as they got the conservatives on their side, as soon as they got the wealthy and the elites on their side, their numbers grew exponentially. And that, as soon as they gained that 1 inch of foothold, they just exploded and just grabbed power in almost overnight. I mean, this happened in a span of a couple of years. To appeal to Italian conservatives, fascism adopted policies such as promoting family values, including policies designed to reduce the number of women in the workforce by limiting the woman's role to that of a mother. Again, you're going to start seeing a lot of parallels. And I'm just saying that there's a lesson to be learned here. The fascists banned literature on birth control and increased penalties for abortion in 1926, declaring both crimes against the state. We're at 14 states that are basically banning abortion, and more are trying to attempt to basically challenge Roe versus Wade. Though fascism adopted a number of positions designed to appeal to reactionaries, the fascists sought to maintain fascism's revolutionary character, with Angelo Oliveira Olivetti saying, quote, fascism would like to be conservative, but it will be by being revolutionary. The fascists supported revolutionary action and committed to secure law and order to appeal to both conservatives and syndicalists. Oof. Prior to fascism's accommodation to the political right, fascism was a small, urban, northern Italian movement that had about a couple thousand members. And oh yeah, this is what I was saying earlier. After fascism's accommodation of the political right, fascist movement membership soared to approximately 250,000 by 1921. This is in a span of 5-6 years, I would say. And this is coming from lumenlearning.com. We're also going to be citing Encyclopedia Britannica and historians.org. So we have a couple of different websites to go through here. Okay, so basically, where were we? Beginning in 1922, fascist paramilitaries escalated their strategy from attacking socialist office and homes of socialist leadership figures to violent occupation of cities. The fascists met little serious resistance from authorities and proceeded to take over several northern Italian cities. The fascists attacked the headquarters of socialist and Catholic labor unions in Cremona and imposed forced Italianization upon the German-speaking population of Trent and Bolzano. After seizing these cities, the fascists made plans to take Rome. So this is the famous March on Rome, and they eventually took power. But these guys didn't just start like this, and there's just multiple different sources that indicate that the only reason they were allowed or had the foothold is because they allied themselves with the Conservative Party. The money for this, yeah, here, this is where I got that from. Around Mussolini's banner, there grew rapidly an army of followers, from gangsters to sincere patriots. See, this is under the guise of patriotism, which patriotism versus nationalism are two completely different things. But that's how they painted this whole thing. Some of them were organized into strong armed squads and armed and uniformed, known as the Black Shirts, the famous Mussolini Black Shirts militia. The money for this came from alarmed industrialists and others of wealth who saw in the Mussolini movement a tool to suppress the radical revolution they feared, and that Mussolini kept assuring them was on their way. So like I was saying, they basically scared these wealthy people into funding them, and they did it out of the only reason they would do anything like this is in their eyes, they wanted to keep power. So they figured that Mussolini would be the answer to that. The proclaimed aims and principles of the fascist movements are perhaps a little consequence now. It promised almost everything from extreme radicalism in 1919 to extreme conservatism in 1922. In the main, its program was centered on the idea of action, but in reality it meant for Italy naked personal power achieved and maintained through violence. Yeah, I mean, the fascists were extremely violent, and were not really stopped when they should have been. The fascists put up candidates in the parliamentary elections of 1921. They were not very successful despite the undercover support of some of the elements from the government, although they received only about 5% of the total popular vote. But they did succeed in planting the impression that they had the solution to all of Italy's post-war ills. The existing government had none, and so the March on Rome, a colossal bluff, turned out to be a colossal success. Fascism at first didn't start as totalitarian. In fact, the first 3 years of fascism, it ran basically like a republic. So After that, it just Mussolini decided to become dictator. When the king called on Mussolini to form a government in October of 1922, very few people in the world had any idea of what was meant by a totalitarian form of government. Mussolini himself probably did not know what he was going to do, except stay in power. A parliamentary majority backed the fascist government at the beginning, and most of the people thought fascism was a temporary interlude. And that's the mistake. They thought that this was just going to go away. It didn't, until, of course, after World War II. They thought that Italy could later return to freedom, and in the meantime, fascism could take care of the crisis. So in the time of crisis, they turned to someone they didn't understand, and they thought that this was an immediate solution to the post World War One. It wasn't. It wasn't. It just led them down a very, very, very dark path. And again, you're gonna see a lot of parallels as to what is happening and what could potentially happen. Doesn't necessarily mean, and nor do I believe, that it is right now possible. But if we don't pay attention, if we don't understand history, then the road gets paved for a situation like this here. And people say, and the people that say, oh, it can't happen here, remember that back in World War II, we had an American Nazi party. It was quite big, and it started having rallies, and it was alive here. It happened. So to think that it can't happen here is lulling yourself into a false sense of security. When Mussolini stepped into power, fascism had none of the superior race, blood, and soil trappings that came to Germany with Hitlerism. All of the other elements of fascism were there. However, belief in violence, disbelief in legal process, rabid nationalism, and so on. But the regime was not totalitarian in its... Okay, yeah, there you go. But the regime was not totalitarian in its first 3 years. Opposition parties were still legal. A strong opposition of press operated under difficulties, and Mussolini kept talking about a return to normalcy. It was only in 1925 that fascism fully threw off the mask. The murder of a socialist leader by the name of Marechoi, a fearless parliamentary opponent of fascism, was a signal. Though through every device of open violence and concealed trickery, the totalitarian machine was built up. This meant complete state control of every phase of human activity. It meant fostering the idea that the fascist party and the Italian state were one and the same. It meant defying the nation and the leader. It meant the nourishing of nationalistic and warlike passions. It meant, in the end, alliance with the other great totalitarian power in Europe, acceptance of the debased and debasing theories of Nazism, and finally, an active participation in the war. So, as I was saying earlier, even some historians and political scientists have disagreements about the exact nature of fascism, because there's just so many iterations, and it's so stochastic would be the word. For some scholars, I mean, even its origins, there's a lot of debate. Some scholars, for example, this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Some scholars, for example, regard it as a socially radical movement with ideological ties to the Jacobins of the French Revolution, whereas others see it as an extreme form of conservatism inspired by a 19th century backlash against the ideals of the Enlightenment. Some find fascism deeply irrational, where others are impressed with the rationality in which it served the material interest of its supporters. Some attempt to explain fascist demonologies as the expression of irrationality, misdirected anger, and frustration, where others emphasize the rational ways in which these demonologies were used to perpetuate professional or class advantages. Finally, whereas some consider fascism to be motivated primarily by aspirations, by a desire for a cultural regeneration and the creation of a new man, others place greater weight on fascism's anxieties, on its fear of communist revolution, and even of the less centrist electoral victories. Okay, so we're gonna go through some of the basic, basic characteristics. Opposition to Marxism. Fascism made no secret of their hatred of Marxists of all stripes, from totalitarian communists to democratic socialists. Fascists promised to deal more firmly with Marxists than had earlier, more democratic rightist parties. Mussolini first made his reputation as a fascist by unleashing armed squads of black shirts on striking workers and peasants from 1920 to 1921. Many early Nazis had served in the Freikorps, the paramilitary groups formed by ex-soldiers to suppress leftist activism in Germany at the end of World War I. So, contrary to popular belief, the Nazis were fascist. To the notion, or to the idea, that the Nazi Party was some kind of radical left party is just demonstrably false. This is something that's been going on, I believe, in the more extreme side of the right. They are spreading this idea, and I think, man, what was his name, who kept spreading that, or who alluded to the idea that Hitler was some kind of radical leftist. I think he's like one of the IDW people who promoted that nonsense. Okay, so oh, Dave Rubin. Oh god, the guy with the the guy who's promoting a lot of special ideas. Okay, so the next characteristic is, all these like extreme right wing people have been promoting the idea of the idea that the Nazi Party was of a left of a radical left wing is just false. It was a fascist movement inspired by Italy's Mussolini. Fascist movement criticized parliamentary democracy for allowing the Marxist threat to exist in the first place. So they completely do not like any type of democracy, simply because it gives the Marxist a chance to exist. This is going back to the first characteristic, that they just despise absolutely Marxist anything that involves the left. Okay. Opposition to political and cultural liberalism. Although circumstances made accommodations for political liberalism necessary, the fascists condemned this doctrine for placing the rights of the individual above the needs of the Volk, encouraging divisiveness, political pluralism, tolerating decadent values, and limiting the power of the state. Fascists accused liberal fellow travelers of wittingly or unwittingly abetting communism. In 1935, the Crossfire berated moderates, i.e. democratic conservatives, for indirectly aiding the communists through their taste for compromise and hesitation. Larocque urged the French people to stand up against revolution and its sordid ally, moderation, warning that on the final day of reckoning, complicit moderates or guardians unfaithful to their charge would be at the head of the list of the guilty. Fascist propagandists also attacked cultural liberalism, claiming that encouraged moral relativism, godless materialism, and selfish individualism, and thereby undermining traditional morality. Anti-Semitic fascists associated liberalism with Jews in particular. Indeed, one precursor of Nazism, the political theorist Theodor Fritsch, claimed that to succumb to a liberal idea was to succumb to the Jew with one himself. Wow. Yikes. So again, you see where we're starting to see parallels just this whole liberalism is terrible, and the culture war, and all this is just way too much. It's just the parallels are disturbing. Totalitarian ambitions. Although Hitler had not revealed the full extent of his totalitarian aims before he came to power as Fuhrer of the Third Reich, he attempted to not only control all political power, but also to dominate many institutions and organizations that were previously independent of the state, such as courts, churches, universities, social clubs, etc. So yeah, totalitarian ambitions. This is a product of far-right extremism. It's the same nonsense why extreme left and extreme right just don't work. Before, this is interesting. This is like how they snuck themselves into power. Before fascists came into power, however, they often disavowed totalitarian aims. This was especially true in countries such as France, where conservatives were alarmed by reports of the repression of dissident conservatives in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. After Hitler's crackdown on Roman Catholic dissidents in Germany in 1934 and 1935, French fascists took down pains to deny that they were totalitarians, thus to alienate potential Catholic supporters in France. Indeed, they attacked statism and advocated a more decentralized government that would favor local economic elites. Okay, that's interesting. Conservative and economic programs. These are all just the overall or basic characteristics of fascism. There were a few, usually small, fascist movements whose social and economic goals were left centrist. Hendrik de Man in Belgium and Marcel Defeat in France, both former socialists, were among those who hoped eventually to achieve a fairer distribution of wealth by appealing to fascist nationalism and class conciliation. In Poland, the camp of national radicalism supported land reform and nationalization of industry, and fascists in Libya and Syria advocated for Arab socialism. In Japan, Kira Iki, an early theorist of Japanese fascism, called for the nationalization of large industries, a limited degree of worker control, and modern welfare program for the poor. However, the economic programs of the great majority of fascist movements were extremely conservative, favoring the wealthy far more than the middle class and the working class. Their talk of National Socialism was quite fraudulent in this respect. This is partially where the idea of the Nazi Party being a socialist party, only socialist in name, the National Socialist Workers' Party or whatever, they only borrowed that for branding purposes, because back then socialism and stuff like that was more, the people were more open to it. That was a form of government, and it was more prominent back then. So to have your name brand as the National Socialist Workers' Party was more palatable, and didn't sound as bad. But yeah, this was just a like the states. This was just a fraudulent mask in this respect. Although some workers were duped by it before the fascists came to power, most remained loyal to the traditional anti-fascist parties of the left. As historian John Weiss noted, property and income distribution and the traditional class structure remained roughly the same under fascist rule. What changes there were favored the old elites or certain segments of the party leadership. Historian Roger Eatwell concurred, quote, "If a revolution is understood to mean a significant shift in class relations, including a redistribution of income and wealth, there was no Nazi revolution," unquote. This is why you can't force things onto people, whether you're extreme right or extreme left. That's why these movements end up failing. Because if you try to do, this political revolution and you try to impose yourself, people don't take that. People don't like that. I mean, the fascists did it through violence, and so did the extreme left, the Communist Party. I mean, look at the Bolshevik Revolution. All that was done through violence. It's not because people wanted it like that. Mussolini, a leading member of the Italian Socialist Party before World War I, became a fierce anti-socialist after the war. After coming to power, he banned all Marxist organizations and replaced their trade unions with government-controlled corporatist unions. Kind of like how these huge corporations are allowed to have their own in-house system where they take care of complaints. They have like this this forced arbitration. Yeah, it's kind of like that. Okay, so corporatism is the next characteristic of fascism. The fascist economic theory of corporatism called for organizing each of the major sectors of industry, agriculture, the professions, and the arts into state or managed-controlled trade unions and employer associations or corporations, each of which would negotiate labor contracts and working conditions and represent the general interest of their professions in a larger assembly of corporations or corporatist parliament. Huh. I mean, this is kind of like this is kind of like forced arbitration. It's like they have like their own in-house way of dealing with this. That is very interesting. Extensive corporatist legislation was passed in Italy beginning in the late 1920s, creating several government-controlled unions and outlawing strikes. The Salazar regime in Portugal, using the Italian legislation as its model, outlawed the trade union federation, and all leftist unions made corporatist unions compulsory for workers, declared strikes illegal, all of which contributed to a decline in real wages. Croatian, Russian, Argentinian, Brazilian, and Chilean fascism also proposed corporatist solutions to labor management strife. Hey Royskoy, welcome to the stream. There's a few links that I'm using here. I'll actually go ahead and share it. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll post the links in the description below. That's one of them. We're right now using the Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica. We have also this link here. And we have one more. We have a few. Hey, no problem. No problem. I think we have over here. Yeah, we have a couple of links that we're just using as references, and also to illustrate the parallels of what's happening. Okay, so the common characteristics. So it's interesting. They basically advocated for a system in which corporations took it upon themselves to self-manage this whole worker thing. And it's also interesting because this contributed to decline in real wages, which Mussolini also admitted to, and he said, well, you know, and this is exactly like the opposite of what these conservatives are saying. How, oh, you know, Amazon has its own way of dealing with things, and every mega corporation has its own forced arbitration, right to work, or whatever. This doesn't help the workers. Hey, thank you so much for the follow. Appreciate it. Roy Koshi, thank you. Appreciate it. It's interesting because you would think, or they claim, these conservatives nowadays, the more modern day conservatives claim that the corporations are right and that this whole like system is good for the workers, but in reality, in both history and today, we see that wages are just have been either stagnant, or if we don't adjust for inflation, they're lowering. Real wages, like the real dollar amount that you have, is not going up under this type of system. And this is a very similar system that we have today. Okay, and the next characteristic of fascism: alleged equality of social status. In the political discourse of the fascist right, economic problems related to large disparities of the wealth between the rich and the poor were treated as problem of social status and class prejudice. These are the swamp. Rather than attacking upper class wealth, fascists attack upper class snobism, the swamp. Rather than narrowing class differences, they taught that these differences were subjective and unimportant. National socialism was said to occur when a Hitler youth from a rich family and a Hitler youth from a poor family became comrades. No wealth had to be shared. This concept of socialism was in part an outgrowth of the Nazi attempt to transfer military values to civilian life. In war, it didn't matter if the soldier next to you came from a poor or wealthy background, as long as he fought loyally. Okay, imperialism. Many fascist movements had imperialistic aims. Hitler hoped that his Drangnak Osten, by conquering Eastern Europe and Russia, would not only prove the racial superiority of the Aryans over Slavs, but also provide enough plunder and Lebensraum, living space, which is the same thing of Espacio Vitale from the Italians, to overcome continuing economic difficulties at home. Mussolini's imperial ambitions were directed at North Africa, and his armies invaded Ethiopia in 1935. So imperialism is just another characteristic. Military values is the same, ties into imperialism. They valued the military because our military is the best in the world. It is absolutely necessary that we spend $700 and something billion. You see like the small parallels that are starting to appear as we start to make a deep dive into fascism. Fascists favored military values such as courage, unquestioning obedience to authority, discipline, and physical strength. They've also adapted the outward trappings of military organizations such as paramilitary uniforms and Roman salutes. Hitler imagined a god who presided over military conflicts and ensured the survival of the fittest. Mussolini was famous for slogans such as "A minute on the battlefield is worth a lifetime of peace. Better to live an hour like a lion than 100 years like a sheep." Oof. Which Trump kind of quoted this. Anyways, again, nothing. I'm not saying anything. I'm just pointing out parallels. Volksgemeinschaft. Hitler envisioned the idea of German society as a I can't speak German. A racially unified and hierarchical organized body in which the interests of the individuals would be strictly subordinate to those of the nation, or folk, I guess, people. That's interesting. Mass mobilization. Fascists characteristically attempt to win popular support and consolidate their power by mobilizing the population in mass meetings, parades, and other gatherings. Like having campaign rallies even though you're not campaigning throughout the year. Exploiting principle borrowed from modern American advertisement, which stressed the importance of appealing to the audience emotions rather than to reason. Fascists use such gatherings to create patriotic fervor and to encourage fanatic enthusiasm for the fascist cause. I mean, I don't even have to point this out, do I? The Nazi rallies at Nuremberg, for example, were organized with theatrical precision and featured large banners, paramilitary uniforms, martial music, torchlight parades, bonfires, and force of fascist salutes, accompanied by prompted shouts of Sieg Heil. Hitler believed that it's best to hold gatherings at night when audiences would be more susceptible than in the daytime to rational appeals. Fascists also sought to regiment the population, especially young people, by infiltrating local social networks. For example, how we have 4chan, 8chan, and all these other like Gab and all these other, even like the YouTube community, Twitter community. Every large social media place has this little clique, and they use that and exploit that very, very, very well. But you know, obviously in the 1920s they didn't have that, so instead they infiltrated social networks, tavern groups, and veteran sports, church, student, and other organizations, and providing soup kitchens, vacation outings, nationalistic ceremonies for townspeople. I mean, it just starts getting creepier and creepier the more you really read this, and the more you understand what fascism is. The leadership principle. Fascists defended the Führerprinzip, leadership principle, the belief that the party and the state should have a single leader with absolute power. Hitler was the Führer, and Mussolini the douche. I can't pronounce that. Douche. Both words for leader, who gave the orders and everyone else had to obey. The authority of the leader was often enhanced by his personal charisma. The leadership principle was also conceived to apply at lower levels of the political and social hierarchy. Fascist organizations sometimes exhibited the so-called corporal syndrome, in which persons willingly submit to the authority of those above them in exchange for the gratification they derive from dominating those below. Yeah. Okay. Next characteristic, the new man. Fascists aim to transform the ordinary man into the new man, a virile being who would put decadent bourgeoisie, cerebral Marxists, and feminine liberals to shame. You know, the soy boys, the cucks, to liberals to shame. The new man would be physically strong. We have all the strong people. We have the bikers. Would be physically strong and morally hard, admiring what was forceful and vigorous, and despising everything weak and soft. As Hitler described him, the new man was slim, slender, quick like a greyhound, tough like leather, and hard like Krupp steel. The new man was a man of the past as well as the future. Italian fascists held up the soldiers of ancient Rome as models, and Bertrand de Jovenel praised the brutal barons of the Middle Ages and the original conquerors of Europe, the Franks. Fascist man, he wrote, was a throwback to the warrior and property. Property holder of yesteryear, to the type of man who was the head of a family and a clan. When this type of man ceases to win esteem and disappears, then the process of decadence begins. Whew. Yeah. Glorification of the youth. Yeah, I mean, this is also going, to the Nazi belief of the superior Aryan race. Glorification of the youth. Fascists praised the young for their physical strength and honored them for their idealism and spirit of self-sacrifice, qualities they said were often lacking in their elders. Fascists often presented their cause in generational terms. As the young Goebbels declared, the old ones don't even want to understand that we young people even exist. They defend their power to the last, but one day they will be defeated after all. The youth finally must be victorious. I kind of believe that's with any like extreme movement, but I guess this is just like also in addition to, because again, these are just general characterizations of fascism. Education as a character building. Fascist educators emphasize character building over intellectual growth. They value the transmission of information. Gotta run. Roy Koshi says, gotta run. We'll check out more later. Thank you. And again, I'll post this on YouTube and you can watch the VOD later. I really appreciate you stopping by. Thank you. Education as character building. Again, it's just creepy the more you start getting into this. Fascist educators emphasized character building over intellectual growth. They valued the transmission of information, inculcated blind obedience to authority, and discouraged critical and independent thinking that challenged fascist ideology. According to Nazi writer Hermann Klaus, the teacher is not just an instructor and a transmitter of knowledge, he is a soldier serving on the cultural and political front of National Socialism. For intellectuals belong to the people or they are nothing. The ultimate aim of Nazi education was not to make students think more richly, but to make them war more vigorously. As Nazi Minister of Culture in Prussia wrote, the Nationalist Socialist Revolution has replaced the image of the cultivated personality with the reality of the true German man. It has substituted for the humanistic conception of a culture of system of education which develops out of the fellowship of actual battle. Teachers who did not practice these principles or who appeared skeptical of Nazi idealism were subject to dismissal, often as the result of reports by student informers. So it's way creepy. Like, you know, all these scientists, people who have studied economics, useless. I understand. I have the knowledge. I can solve your problem. Don't worry about the facts. I have the solution, and it's a great solution. It's the best solution of all. Nobody does solutions like I do. Okay, so moving on to the next characteristic, decadence and spirituality. Some of the ugliest aspects of fascism, intolerance, repression, and violence were fueled by what fascists saw as a morally justified struggle against decadence. For fascists, decadence meant a number of things: materialism, self-indulgence, hedonism, cowardice, and physical and moral softness. It was associated with rationalism, skepticism, atheism, humanitarianism, and political, economic, and gender democracy. These are all creepy things that are appearing here in the US. You know, these just bleeding heart liberals, these people are destroying this nation. They're weak. The humanitarianism is just not important. America first. For anti-Semitic fascist, Jews were the most decadent of all. I'm sorry. Was also associated with rationalism, skepticism, atheism, humanitarianism, and political, economic, and gender democracy, as well as rule by the Darwinian, unfit by the weak and the female. You know, the beta males, right? For anti-Semitic fascists, Jews were the most decadent of all. The opposite of decadence was spirituality, which transcended materialism and generated self-discipline and virility. The spiritual attitude often involved a certain emotional asceticism that enabled one to avoid feelings of pity for one's victims. It also involved Darwinian notions of survival of the fittest, a belief in the right of natural elites to upward social and political mobility. If you're born into money and you have power, and you must continue to cement that power. And accommodations with members of the upper class. It prized hierarchy, respect for superiors, and military obedience. It was forceful toward the weak, and it was male. The spiritual attitude was also hateful. In 1934, Ernest Röhm, leader of the SA, worried that Germans had forgotten how to hate. Virile hate, he wrote, has been replaced by feminine lamentation. But he who is unable to hate cannot love either. Fanatical love and hate, their fires kindle and flames of freedom. Oof. Obviously, this is a more obvious characteristic of fascism, but not limited to, and that's violence. Fascists reacted to their opponents with physical force. Primo de Rivera maintained that no other argument is admissible than that of fists and pistols when justice or the fatherland is attacked. So basically, I mean, you could see some of these far right movements are extremely violent. In fact, they still hold the crown for the most amount of domestic terrorism in the U.S. Especially in terms of political violence, the far right has that crown hands down, like hands down. I think over 90% of political violence is from the extreme right. But his attack before he came to power, Mussolini sent his black shirts to assault socialist organizers throughout Italy, and later he sent many leftists to prison. Hitler's stormtroopers served a similar function, and Nazi concentration camps at first in turn more Marxist than Jews. Nor were dissent conservatives spared Nazi violence. You know, he was a weak Republican anyways. Nobody wants him. In regards, I'm making a reference to Justin Amash. You know, the guy is a weak Republican, not good for the party, so ostracize him. So if you're not with us, get out of here. Hitler's infamous blood purge of 1934, in which Röhm and other SA leaders were summarily executed, and also claimed the lives of Kurt von Schleyer, the last chancellor of the Weimar Republic, and his wife, who were murdered in their homes. To his critics, Hitler replied, "People accuse us of being barbarians. We are barbarians, and we're proud of it." Huh. Oh, man. So, yeah, I mean, that's obvious. Violence is a very, very characteristic of fascism. Extreme nationalism. Whereas cosmopolitan conservative often supported international cooperation and admired elite culture in other countries, fascists espoused extreme nationalism and cultural parochialism. I have no idea what that word means. Fascist ideologues taught that national identity was the foundation of individual identity and should not be corrupted by foreign influences, especially if they were left-wing. You know, especially if a congressperson who is of a left-leaning and a foreigner who became a citizen, you know, they should go back to their country. Obviously, they were left-wing, should not be corrupted by foreign influences, especially if they were left-wing. Nazism condemned Marxist and liberal internationalism as threat to Germany national unity. Fascists in general wanted to replace internationalist class solidarity with nationalist class collaboration. The Italian, French, and Spanish notion of integral nationalism was hostile to individualism and political pluralism. Unlike democratic conservatives, fascists accused their political opponents of being less patriotic than they were, sometimes even labeling them as traitors. These four progressive women, they hate America. They're traitors. They should go back to their countries, even though 3 or 4 of them were born here. But they're just traitors. They hate America. They're not patriotic. They don't know how to love America. Portuguese fascists spoke of international foreigners who were anti-nation. In the 1930s, some French fascist organizations even rejected the label fascist lest they be perceived as beholden to Germany. So they didn't even want to they didn't want to have the label fascist because they didn't even want to be beholden to the Germans, even though the Italians were the ones that originally invented that word. But anyways, in France, immigrants, particularly left-wing immigrants, were special targets of fascist nationalism. Jean Renaud of French Solidarity demanded that all foreigners seeking residence in France be rigorously screened and that the unfit be denied entry without pity, especially social revolutionaries who made France not a refuge for the oppressed but a depository for trash. You know, they're not sending their best. These are animals. These are criminals. So on and so forth. Oh, here's my favorite one. Another characteristic of fascism. Scapegoating. Fascists often blame their country's problems on scapegoats. Jews, Freemasons, Marxists, immigrants were prominent among groups that were demonized. You know, it's the swamp. We gotta drain the swamp. It's the brown people that are coming. It's an invasion of brown people. You know, according to fascist propaganda, the long depression of the 1930s resulted less from insufficient government regulation of the economy or inadequate lower class purchasing power than from Judeo-Masonic Bolshevik conspiracies. Left-wing agitation, which by the way still exists today. Left-wing agitation and the presence of immigrants, these dirty animals that we have to put in cages. The implication was that depriving these demons of their power and influence would cause the nation's major problems go away. Okay. Populism. Fascism praised the Volk and pandered to populist anti-intellectualism. Again, just scary parallels. Nazi art criticism, for example, upheld the populist view that the common man was the best judge of art, and that art that did not appeal to popular taste was decadent. Also populist was the Nazi propaganda theme that Hitler was a new man who emerged from the depths of the people. Unlike left-wing populism, fascist populism did not attribute workers' hardships to big business and big landowners, and did not advocate measures such as progressive taxation, higher pay for industrial and farm workers, protection of unions, and the right to strike. In general, it spared the wealth of the upper class, except that for belonging to Jews in the case of Nazis. Revolutionary image. Fascists sometimes portrayed their movement as new and revolutionary, an image that appealed not to just young but older literary modernists such as Filippino Marinetti, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, William Butler Yeats, D.H. Lawrence, and Paul de Man. However, dozens of fascist writers also praised cultural traditionalism or rootedness. Under the Third Reich, Goebbels subsidized an exhibition of modern art not to celebrate its glory but to expose its decadence. He called it simply the exhibition of degenerate art. Fascism's claims that newness did not prevent its propagandists from pandering to fearful traditionalists who associated cultural modernism with secular humanism, feminism, sexual license, and the destruction of the Christian family. Again, does it start to sound familiar? Anti-urbanism. Fascists also pandered to anti-urban feelings. The Nazis won most of their electoral support from rural areas and small towns. In Nazi propaganda, the ideal German was not an urban intellectual, but a simple peasant, and uprooted intellectualism was considered a threat to the deep irrational sources of the Volk soul. Jews were often portrayed and therefore condemned as quintessentially city dwellers. In 1941, Leroy commented, "The theory of families of good stock who have their roots in the earth leads us to conclusions not far from those of Walter der Minister of Agriculture for the Reich." Romanian fascism relied heavily on the support of landed peasants who distrusted the wicked city. The agrarian wing of Japanese fascism praised the peasant soldier and denigrated the industrial worker. Wow, this is a lot to cover. Sexism and misogyny. Under fascist regime, women were urged to perform their traditional gender roles as wives and mothers and bear as many children for the nation. Mussolini instituted policies severely restricting women's access to jobs outside the home, policies that later had to be revised to meet wartime exigencies, and he distributed gold medals to mothers who produced the most children. In Germany, the Nazis forbade female party members from giving orders to male members. In a speech in 1937, Charles Vallin, vice president of the French Social Party, equated feminists with unsubordinate proletarians. It is not with class struggle that the social question will be resolved, yet it is toward a sort of class struggle opposing the feminine proletariat to the masculine capitalist, and feminism is leading us. Don de Jouvenel equated women with hedonism, and hedonism with decadence. In Europe, he wrote, in 1938 had grown soft and feminine from pleasure-seeking, becoming like a woman who had just escaped a frightening accident. She needed light, warmth, and music, according to Jouvenel. An atmosphere of facility corrupted everything, and people had become increasingly unwilling to take on painful tasks. In short, he believed that feminization of Europe had been its downfall. Gosh darn these beta males. In a similar vein, Drew LaRochelle claimed that educated women undermine his manhood. So, man, that's having these women be educated is a problem. I mean, I think that says more about him than anything. He characterized political movements he disliked as feminine. So, again, these beta males are ruining. These beta males are basically the answer to anything that the right doesn't like. He dislikes as feminine, and those he admired as masculine, strong, men. Fascism for him being the most masculine of all. Varieties of fascism. Just as Marxists, liberals, and conservatives differed within and between various countries, so did fascists. In some countries, there were rivalries between even native fascist movements over personal, tactical, and other differences. Fascist movements also displayed significant differences with respect to their acceptance of racism and particularly anti-Semitism, their identification with Christianity, and their support for Nazi Germany. Acceptance of racism. Although not all fascists believed in biological racism, it played a central role in the actions of those who did. Nazism was viciously racist, especially in its attitude toward Jews. The Nazis blamed the Jews for almost everything wrong in Germany, and the Great Depression, from the Great Depression to the rise of Marxism to the evils of international capitalism, globalism, these globalists, and decadence in art. The Holocaust, culminating in the final solution to the Jewish question, was an immensely cruel outcome of this hatred. Okay, so we all know, what happened there. The acceptance of racism is the acceptance of racism was a characteristic of fascism. In fact, in the United States, fascist movements were racist and sometimes specifically anti-Semitic to varying degrees. We point to the Ku Klux Klan in this regard. The Ku Klux Klan and other groups preached the supremacy of white race. Some fascists in Japan taught the Japanese were a superior race, and the Syrian fascists claimed superiority of those people as well. That's just like a general characteristic of fascism. Interesting. Mussolini opposed anti-Semitism in the first 12 years of his rule. After 1933, however, he sometimes allowed anti-Semites within his party to condemn unpatriotic Jews in the press. In 1938, the Italian government passed anti-Semitic legislation, and later it abetted the Holocaust. Prior to German takeover of Austria, the fascist regime of Dollfuss and Schuschnigg also rejected anti-Semitism, and many Austrian Jews, including Sigmund Freud, supported them for resisting Nazism. So, that there's some differences between factions of fascism, but they are rooted or partially rooted in racism. Identification with Christianity. Most fascist movements portray themselves as defenders of Christianity and the traditional Christian families against atheists and immoral humanists. This is why Pence is there. It's creepy, very, very creepy. I mean, what what's more there to say in terms of that? I mean, we're a Christian nation, is what they say. But I mean, obviously, the reality is this nation was founded on the freedom of religion, allow the idea of practicing whatever religion or no religion. That was what this nation was founded on. In fact, our founding fathers were not all Christians. Some pretended to be. Some had to play nice to fit in the Masonic societies. But this country is not founded on Christianity. This country was not originally a Christian nation. But it is a characteristic of fascism, which again, the parallels just keep lining up. Support for Germany. Okay, this is the during the war, a lot of these fascists kind of got together and formed the Axis powers. The intellectual origins of fascism. Mussolini and Hitler did not invent fascist ideology, but Mussolini was the first one to kind of mainstream it or adopt that name and connect it to that ideology. Indeed, fascism was neither a 20th century creation nor a peculiarly Italian or German one. Originating in the 19th century, fascist ideas appeared in the works of writers from France, as well as Austria, Germany, and Italy, including political theorists such as Theodor Fritsch, Paul Anton de la Garde, Julius Langben, Georg Lanz von Lebensfeld, Joseph de Maistre, Charles Maurras, and Georges Sorel, scientists and philosophers such as Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Giovanni Gentile. I wonder if that's where like Gentiles came from. No? Gustave Le Bon, Friedrich Nietzsche. Wow, I can't pronounce any of these names. That's like 0 for 10 names right now. Vilfredo Pareto, Karl Vogt, and Ernest Haeckel. Historians and social thinkers such as Joseph Arthur Comte Gobineau, Hippolyte Taine, and Heinrich von Treitz. Artists, writers, and journalists. Okay, I'm not going through these names because I can't pronounce any of these names. Gabriel D'Annunzio, Richard Wagner. Okay, that's easy. Odor Drummond, Maurice Barres, and Guido von List, and conservative politicians such as Otto Bacco and Adolf Stocker. Many fascist ideas derive from the reactionary backlash to the progressive revolutions of 1789, 1830, 1848, 1878, and to the secular liberalism and social radicalism that accompanied these upheavals. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in this whole, just going through the characteristics of fascism, going through how it became or why was it allowed to thrive, where did this ideology come from, but it all comes as these are all reactionary movements. These fascists came into power through reactionary movements, and now we are seeing a progressive movement. We are seeing a more push for a better society and more left-wing politics. We have Bernie's political revolution, and it's catching on to some of the other Democrats' campaigns. And the more we see that, the stronger that movement gets, the stronger the right movement gets as well, which is like crazy. I mean, the parallels is just insane. I'm only doing an entire episode devoted to this because I think that if we're not careful, this is a road we could easily be heading towards. We're still at a stage where we can stop it and identify it and just call it out and basically make it go back home, because this comes and goes. These fascist movements, extreme right-wing movements come and go. I mean, there was a time where KKK held real power. There was a time where there was an American Nazi party. So these things come and go, but every time they do, you have to call it out and you have to stop it before it seriously cements its power. And unfortunately, this has been as close, I think, that we've ever gotten to it. I mean, if you listen to our current dear leader speak, it's creepy the kind of stuff he says versus the kind of stuff that we've gone through today. I mean, just take a listen.
You know what a globalist is, right?
Globalist.
You know what a globalist.
International. We just literally read about the contempt for these people.
A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that.
I mean, obviously, I don't think this guy understands the full definition or the full scope of what he's doing, but it is speaking a certain language and to a certain crowd, and it's working.
You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist. So
I mean, need I say more? I don't have to call Donald Trump anything. He's doing it himself. I mean, he's doing it himself.
John, go ahead.
Three of the congresswomen that you talked about the wars in America, going back to fix the problems. What were you talking about?
Well, they're very unhappy. I'm watching them. All they do is complain. So all I'm saying is, if they want to leave, they can leave, John. They can leave. I mean, I look at Omar. I don't know. I never met her. I hear the way she talks about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has killed many Americans. She said, you can hold your chest out. You can, when I think of America, when I think of Al-Qaeda, I can hold my chest out. When she talked about the World Trade Center.
Okay, obviously those are him going off the rails. You know, somebody let him out of his home or something. But this guy is obvious. That was an obvious lie, by the way. But it's just creepy the kind of stuff this guy says, and I don't think even he himself understands it. Or maybe he does. I don't know. But the reality is, we have come to a crossroads, and we need to decide where we want to go as a country. And the history is very clear on how these type of things formed and what were their results. Do we really want to go there? Is that really what we are? It's really up to us. And all we have to do is just take a deep look inside ourselves and decide, now that we're at a crossroads, which way we're gonna go. And that is basically the whole premise of this episode. But unfortunately, guys, that is all the time I have today. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Supreme Heretic. Thank you, Roy Koshi, for the follow. You can also check out the YouTube channel. I'll leave the link in the channel section. You can follow me on Twitter. I'll leave that, leave all that in the channel description. If you are watching on YouTube, make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe, do all that awesome YouTube stuff. As we know, YouTube is basically stomping on independent creators. Just make sure you do everything you can to start spreading independent media. You can also listen to our podcast, listen to this episode in our podcast at soundcloud.com/ADifficultTruth. I'll be uploading that very soon. And I'll be back next Sunday around 12 Eastern time. So make sure you check the Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, all that. And I will see you guys in the next stream. See ya!
so caught up in the day-to-day, just keeping your head down and fighting to survive. We live by each other like ghosts every day, ignorant to the struggle, the fight with one another, complacent with the fact that our systems are broken, with the fact that the top 10 will always be first in line, the fact that we are killing our planet and allowing them to keep us divided. We must stand together and rise up. It's time we wake up, and that is a difficult